We're so excited today that you could join us for Getting Environmentalists to Vote, a lecture with Nathaniel Stinnett, who is with the Environmental Voter Project. He's their founder and executive director. So I'm going to get started first with a little reminder, a little housekeeping reminder. Please stay muted during the presentation, and then we'll have time at the end for questions, but you can always drop them into the chat. So feel free to participate that way. We really welcome that engagement. And then we'll leave plenty of time at the end for those questions. So, okay, I'll get started. First, I'm just going to introduce a little bit about Actera for those of you who are new to Actera. So we have a 50+ year history in the Bay Area as an environmental nonprofit. We have 4 major pillars where we work, which is beneficial electrification, which deals with the electrification of homes and also businesses and transportation. We have a pillar devoted to healthy plate, healthy planet, which is all about reducing food waste and also eating lower down on the food chain, striving for plant-based diets. We have an education and youth pillar, which is very important for empowering communities and youth to pursue climate change solutions. And we have a workplace sustainability program pillar, which is about resourcing and giving peer sharing for green teams, businesses, and organizations all around the Bay Area to encourage sustainable leadership. And we have 2 focuses at Actera. So we've been around a long time, and we know that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of individual behavior change that you can do to pursue climate action. So we focus on educating our community for that. We also focus on bigger picture policy advocacy to speed along the direction of smart climate policy, because that also makes a big influential change. So we really have both of those things in mind. Today's program is part of our public lecture series, which falls under our education pillar. We also have other features of this pillar, a program called Youth Be the Change, which is middle school curriculum for climate change for educators to learn how to present this material better to middle school students. And we have the Actera Student Ambassadors Program, also known as ASAP, and that's a program for high schoolers and community college students to get involved with climate policy by sending in public comments and getting in touch with their legislators. And it's a really exciting program that we're very proud of. Here's a little bit about what's coming up on our calendar. We have a lot of events in September, lots to look forward to. We have an electric vehicle expo on September 18th. We have a clinic for EV financial incentives to learn how to make EVs more affordable on September 21st. We have our monthly cooking class using induction on September 22nd. We have the Green and Electrified Home Tour, which is in person all along the peninsula and South Bay, 20 different locations on September 24th, where you can tour different electric homes. We have the EV charging workshop, which is part of our Green at Home series, on October 6th. And we have a plant-based cooking class on October 19th. We also have a food waste challenge going on right now. You can sign up at actera.org/events, and it's all about reducing your food waste at home, which is an important contributor to methane. And we have a Power Saver Rewards program that we're encouraging people to sign up for. When you conserve energy during a flex alert, like the series that we had recently, you can actually earn rewards for that. So make sure to look at these different ways that you can save energy during the 4 to 9 window, such as pre-cooling your home before 4 o'clock, delaying the use of major appliances till before or after that period, and turning your thermostat to a slightly warmer temperature, like 78 degrees or higher. And we have a lot more events coming up in this lecture series that we're really excited about. They're coming up on October 13th. We have a youth panel. November 16th, we have Supervisor Joe Simidian, who will be joining us to talk about advocacy. And December 7th, we'll have a workplace panel. So please join us for those events, and you can find out more at actera.org/lectures. We would definitely like to extend our thanks to our series underwriters Mary and Clinton Gilliland, and Armand and Eliane Newkermans. Thank you so much for allowing this program to take place. We also have sponsors and partners to thank. So thank you to the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, as well as our series partners, the Foster, the Forum, and Green Team Network. Just a reminder that if you appreciate our programming, we also appreciate it when you help contribute to make it possible through our donation page, actera.org/donate now. So now we get to the exciting part of the event. Our featured speaker for this afternoon is Nathaniel Stinnett. He's the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. Grist magazine dubbed him the voting guru. I love that. And the New York Times has called him a global climate visionary for his work. So we're really excited to have him. We will have a question and answer period at the end of the lecture, and please use the chat to ask your question or to upvote others' questions. I'm so excited that because it's only 55 days until the election, that this is the perfect time to be talking about environmental voters and their power. So without further ado, I will pass it off to you, Nathaniel, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Wendy. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here with you, and thank you for the invitation. Thank Lauren, Michelle, who I know is helping, thank you. And thank you to all of you who are taking some time out of your afternoon and early evening to learn about environmental politics, environmental voting, and the data science and behavioral science that goes into what modern environmental politics looks like right now. As Wendy mentioned, yeah, 55 days until Election Day. And in fact, yesterday in New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Delaware, we had our final 3 primary elections. So now it's the home stretch to the midterm general elections on November 8th. And I think we're going to have a really good time. I am going to tell you a little bit about the nonprofit that I run, the Environmental Voter Project, but only to use it as an example to discuss sort of the 2 pillars of what this afternoon and evening's lecture is going to be about. And that is how we can identify and then mobilize environmentalists to vote. And while discussing these things, my hope is you will learn quite a bit about how modern political campaigns now target voters, because it's very different from how it was even 5 or 10 years ago. And then also quite a bit about the behavioral science that not only goes into getting people to vote, but behavioral science that's important to anybody in the environmental movement, trying to get other people to conserve energy or do other things that involves changing their behavior. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. And as I mentioned, I'll begin by using my nonprofit, the Environmental Voter Project, as an example for introducing these 2 concepts. So in a nutshell, what the Environmental Voter Project does is we are a nonpartisan nonprofit that is laser focused on just 2 things. 1, identifying already persuaded environmentalists who don't vote. And then 2, turning them into better voters. That's it. We find environmentalists who don't vote, and then we turn them into better voters. And so what that also means is we don't do a lot of the stuff that your typical environmental nonprofits might do. So for instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. As odd as it might sound, we don't even try to persuade people to care more about climate or the environment. In fact, a good way to think of us is we're not even in the mind-changing or opinion-changing business at all. Instead, we are solely in the behavior-changing business. What we do is we identify already persuaded, dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists who don't need their minds changed. They don't need their opinions changed, but they're not voting. And so what they need is a behavioral intervention. What they need is to take this very important, impactful action, voting, And that's where we come in. And as I hope to suggest to you over the coming 15, 20 minutes, there are a lot of very good reasons why we focus in that area. And then we can also get into the details around how we go about doing this, how we identify these non-voting environmentalists, and how we turn them into better voters as context for you understanding the data science and behavioral science. All right, so let's get started then. Why do we have this like weird narrow niche at the Environmental Voter Project? Well, because one of the biggest reasons we can't consistently get progressive climate leadership in the United States, not just at the federal level, but also at the state and local level, is simply because there aren't enough voters who list climate or the environment as their top priority. What you're looking at here is a poll that we recently did. So we fielded this poll in 4 battleground states: Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, and Pennsylvania back in July. And it's a very big poll. You can find it at on the research and results tab on our website. But what this one slide shows is the question we asked of those likely voters, so people who have a history of voting in midterms. And we said, what's your number one most important political priority in the upcoming midterm? 4% of them listed climate or some other environmental issue, even with people who list voter fraud as their top priority. And I would suggest to you that isn't nearly as high as we need it to be. Did we just get a big climate policy win on the federal level? Absolutely. And the good news is that 4% number is about twice as high as it was 4 years ago, last time we had a midterm. So our power is getting greater, and we are starting to get some policy wins, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. The Inflation Reduction Act was far from perfect and far less than what physics demands. And we need to keep getting enormous wins at the federal level, but also at the state and local level if we're going to address the enormity of the climate crisis. And in the political sphere, if only 4% of people who are actually showing up and casting ballots list climate or the environment as their top priority, boy, is it going to be hard to get politicians to lead on these issues. And I don't think we in the environmental movement do ourselves any favors by pretending like we have more power than we actually do. This is a problem. This is a problem, and it's a problem we all need to be focused on addressing. And here is why. If there is one concept that I hope all of you take away from this presentation, let it be what I'm about to discuss, because it is extraordinarily important. Who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. I'm going to say that again because it's so important. Whether you vote or not is public record. And that single concept there is probably the essential building block to not only how all campaigns are run, but how all policy is made at the federal, state, and local level. And allow me to explain why. Let's say that Wendy is running for governor of California. Yay! For better or for worse, Wendy, even though she would make a wonderful governor, has hired me as her campaign manager. And so, Wendy, I'm going to tell everybody what our first campaign meeting looks like, because I've run a whole bunch of campaigns, and this is how they always go. So, Wendy and I and the whole campaign staff are sitting there in our first meeting. We open up our laptops. We look at public voter files. Remember what I said is the one thing you can't forget. Whether you vote or not is public record. And these are the decisions we make. We say, here's a whole bunch of people who aren't registered to vote. Well, Wendy's got limited time and limited money to get 50% plus one of the vote on November 8th. I don't think we're going to talk to these unregistered voters. Well, here are people who are registered to vote, but in public voting files, it looks like they've never actually cast ballots in any election. We're not going to talk to them either. Oh, here's a whole bunch of people who vote, but only in presidential elections. Yeah, I mean, maybe we'll talk to them, but only with our last dollar. I mean, we've got limited time and limited money, and we're trying to win a midterm, not something that coincides with a presidential. Oh, here are people who vote in midterms. Yeah, we're definitely going to talk to them. Oh, and here are people who even vote in local elections. We'll definitely talk to them too. And not to put too fine a point on it, but we literally know these people's names and street addresses. We know these people as individuals, whether you vote or not is public record. And these are the decisions that every campaign and every policymaker makes. And when you know who is going to vote in your election and who isn't, that always determines who you spend your time and money on. And if those are the people you're going to spend your time and money talking to, well, who do you think you're going to poll to figure out whose priorities to pay attention to? Not the non-voters. You're going to poll the people who are actually going to show up and are going to decide whether Wendy is going to become Governor Wendy. And so what that means is politicians know who votes and they know who doesn't vote, and they're not going to pay attention to the priorities of non-voters. And I know that sounds cynical, but it's something that we freely accept in every other aspect of our lives, right? I mean, you wouldn't expect Starbucks to care about people who don't drink coffee, right? Like, why would they market their product to someone who's never going to buy it? You wouldn't expect Ford Motor Company to market their car to my 5-year-old. Like, 5-year-olds can't drive. Why would Ford ever care about what a 5-year-old thinks about their car? Well, politicians are the same way. They know who votes and they know who doesn't vote. And that means when they do polls like this, they are going to poll the people who have a history of showing up. And that's why data like this is bad news for the environmental movement. Because this poll, I promise you, is no different from any other poll that you can look at the federal, state, or local level. And it's important for two reasons. One, obviously, if there are more voters who care deeply about climate and the environment, we can elect more of the so-called right people, good climate leaders. But even more than that, I would suggest to you, it's important to get more voters caring deeply about climate and the environment. Because even when we do elect the right people, it isn't like they can just snap their fingers and get whatever they want. Politicians need to decide what to spend their precious political capital on. And boy, is it hard for them to spend it on something that only 4% of likely voters list as their top priority. And this is one of the big challenges we have in the environmental movement. Huge majorities of voters would prefer government action on climate change. But preferences and priorities are very different. And when you ask voters to focus on the things that are most important to them, boy, does climate and the environment fall down way, way, way lower than we need it to be. All right, I promise you, Wendy didn't schedule me to speak to all of you because I was just going to spout bad news at you. I promise the bad news will end soon. But I think it's important. I mean, we all know that we have significant political challenges in the climate and environmental movement, and we need to accurately diagnose the problem here. It isn't that politicians are just really stupid and they are doing politically dumb stuff. No. They are looking at what the electorate cares most about and choosing to focus their limited time and resources on that. And so we need to change that. We need to change that and get more power. And so this gets to why the Environmental Voter Project focuses in the area that we do. Because what we have come to realize is that the reason so few voters care deeply about climate and the environment is not because too few Americans do. Actually, when you widen the aperture, when you step back and look at a broader universe of people, so not just the voters, but all adults or even just all registered voters, it turns out there are tens of millions of them who do list climate and other environmental issues as a top priority. So why aren't they showing up in polls like this? Well, for one very simple reason. It turns out environmentalists aren't very good at voting. The reason we have this focus at the Environmental Voter Project is that we've come to realize that the environmental movement has less of a persuasion problem than a turnout problem or a behavioral problem. And just to give you an idea of how significant this problem is, the Environmental Voter Project has identified, and I'm going to describe shortly how we're able to identify these numbers. We've identified 10.1 million already registered voters who list climate and the environment as their #1 priority, who just stayed home during the 2016 presidential election and didn't cast a ballot. An election that was decided by 77,000 votes. 10.1 million. Looking at current voting records, we see 13.1 million registered voters who list climate and the environment as their top priority, who have never voted in a midterm or lower turnout election. And so we have to assume that unless there's a really good behavioral intervention, these people aren't going to show up this coming November 8th. This is how significant the turnout problem is in the environmental movement. But I see a lot of you shaking your heads in frustration. Before you get too frustrated, let me suggest to you, yes, this is a problem, but it is also an enormous opportunity. An enormous opportunity. And I know none of you know me, but I promise you I'm not like one of these Pollyannish people who like sees an opportunity in every problem. Like, no, this really is an opportunity. And it's really an opportunity because we live in a moment in time where it's become almost impossible to change people's minds about climate and environmental issues. And what these huge populations of people represent are folks who don't need their minds changed. They are already with us. They are dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists. They just need their behavior changed. And I won't claim that's easy. Of course it's not easy. But it is easier than changing people's opinions. And it is cheaper and it is testable, as I will soon show you. And so this is why we at the Environmental Voter Project have this focus. And it just so happens we spend a lot of time using cutting-edge data science and behavioral science to find these people and then mobilize them to vote, which I think is why Wendy and Lauren thought our work might be of such interest to you. So this is the problem that we're trying to solve at the Environmental Voter Project. And now I'd like to get into how we do this, how we identify and then mobilize these non-voting environmentalists. Then I'll get into a little bit of our results, and then we can have the Q&A. It's essentially a 3-step process. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on this, but please forgive me if it's only a little bit of detail. I don't want to presume to know what aspects of this stuff you're most interested in. That's what the Q&A is for. And so instead, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on all this stuff. And then if you're really interested in a particular aspect of it, we can talk about it during the Q&A and discussion. So the first step, identification. What we do is we build predictive models on voter files to individually identify these voters. Don't worry, I'm going to say more than that. We've got about 3 slides after this that goes into detail on these identification techniques. But for now, let me just say, what these techniques are the same tools that right now sophisticated Senate and gubernatorial campaigns are using to target voters. If you have in your head this idea that campaigns target people by demographic group, you know, soccer moms and NASCAR dads and young people and Latina grandmothers, like, get that out of your head. That is no longer how political campaigns target voters. Instead, they are targeting people on an individual basis They're targeting Marianne Smith at 123 Main Street because they have built these predictive models that I'm going to tell you about in a second that allow them to identify which individual voters care deeply about an issue. And so once we identify people who care so deeply about climate and the environment that it is their number one priority over all other issues, yet we can tell from public voter files that they don't vote, because remember, I'm now going to say it for maybe the fourth or fifth time, whether you vote or not is public record. Well, what that allows us to do is then move to the second part, mobilization, because now we've isolated a population of people who don't need issue education. They don't need to be persuaded to care deeply about climate or clean air or environmental justice or clean water. These are people who, like, you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change. They're just not voting. And so that's when the behavioral science comes in, because now we can be completely agnostic with our messaging. I mean, at this point, we could talk about chocolate chip cookies if that was the best way to get these people to vote. And so what we do is we use hundreds of elections each year to canvass and call and mail and send digital ads to these voters with thousands of volunteers. And we submit our work to what's called randomized control trials, which I'll describe in a second. But what these experiments allow us to do is discern which messages work best at getting these non-voting environmentalists to do just one thing, and that's become better voters. And then finally, the third step is habit reinforcement. You don't need to be a behavioral scientist to just guess that you can't just parachute in once every 2 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on and hope to change people's long-term habits. It's just not how it works. And so what we do is we work year-round in every election, big and small, using those elections as behavioral intervention opportunities to get people to vote, even if the election has nothing to do with environmental policymaking. Because even though a DA's race or a library trustee election or a dog catcher campaign has nothing to do with the environment, it has everything to do with changing people's behavior. So our approach is, how dare we let a single election go by without using it as an opportunity to talk to these non-voting environmentalists and try to change their behavior so that they become habitual voters. All right, now to drill down into a little bit more detail, but only a little bit more, because I do want to speed ahead to the Q&A. I told you I would give you a little bit more detail on how campaigns now individually identify voters. And what they do is they build predictive models. And I'm going to use the example of the Environmental Voter Project, but just know that what I'm about to explain to you is, again, what's going on right now in Senate races and gubernatorial campaigns, and even some big mayoral and congressional races. What we start by doing is having an enormous poll. So not your typical 400 or 600 or 800 respondent poll, but a poll of like 10,000 people per state. But we can get away with it by only asking one question. That's how we can afford to have 10,000 person polls at all these states. All we ask is, hey, what's your number one most important political priority? And let's say in Pennsylvania, out of 10,000 people polled, 800 list climate or some environmental issue as their top priority. Well, then it's the easiest thing in the world for us to start working with data scientists and figure out, okay, what do we know about these 800 people? What data do we have about them in voter files? What census data is there on them? What publicly available behavioral and consumer data do we have access to? And we only use publicly available data, but there's a lot of it out there. And maybe we start seeing some hidden patterns and correlations. Maybe we see, if you're a forestry employee, looks like you're 11 times more likely than the average Pennsylvanian to list climate as your top priority. If you have a new home but no kids, maybe you're 6 times as likely. Oh, looks like basketball fans are more likely than baseball, hockey, and football fans. Ooh, if you subscribe to exercise magazines, you're twice as likely. We find all these predictive data points. none of which on their own are terribly meaningful at all. But when you start clustering them, when you start putting them together in groups and you start saying, wow, if you're a Latina grandmother who lives in Montgomery County suburbs outside of Philadelphia and bought a Volvo between 8 and 10 years ago and subscribed to National Geographic, like, holy moly, you've got a 92% likelihood of listing climate as your top priority. Oh, and then there's another group of people over here and a different group of people over here. And that's how these data scientists start extrapolating from these polling responses to find a whole bunch of other people around a state who are really likely to also list climate and the environment as their #1 priority. And it's a long, iterative process. But at the end of it, after lots of testing and retesting, what we are able to do and what political campaigns are now able to do is literally assign a score to every single individual in a voter file from 0 to 100, telling us how likely they are to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally list it as their #1 issue priority over all other issues. And what you're looking at here is a score distribution of every single voter in the state of Pennsylvania. And as you'll see, there are millions of them who have like less than a 30% likelihood of listing climate as their top priority. Not surprising, right? And then a whole bunch in the middle are kind of maybe 50%, 60% likelihood, not that useful. But then look at the other end. There are well more than 1 million who have such a high likelihood of listing climate and the environment as their top priority that 8, 9 times out of every 10, you're finding someone who, as I said before, like you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change. And these are frighteningly accurate. What we do at the end of building one of these models is we say, okay, thank you very much, data scientists, good job. Here's your check. Then we isolate the top 15% and we send those people out to a competing polling firm. And we say, can you just call up this list of people and ask them an open-ended question, say, hey, what's your #1 most important political priority? And every time we've done that, at least 85% of the respondents have freely offered from the top of their head, oh, climate change, or clean air, clean water. This is a frighteningly accurate way of identifying individuals based on issues that they prioritize. Now, does this mean we've spoken to every single voter in the entire state of Pennsylvania? No, it is a predictive model. It helps us predict who these super environmentalists are, but it's enormously accurate. And then, remember what I said is the one thing you can't forget: whether you vote or not is public record. So we don't need the data scientists to then just figure out, okay, which of these super environmentalists are unlikely to vote. Just as an example, here's a map of the 42,067 super environmentalists in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, who are registered to vote, but they have never cast a ballot before in their entire lives. And not to be creepy, but we literally know them by name and street address. This is how political campaigns now target people. And this is how we at the Environmental Voter Project isolate those people who, as I said before, don't need persuasion messaging. They don't need to be convinced to care about these issues. They just need the behavioral intervention. So then what we do is we canvass, we call, we send postcards, direct mail, digital ads. As you can see, we can't do everything to everybody. Some people live in gated communities or high rises, so we can only canvass about 65% of our targets, but we can call more of them and mail even more of them. And what we do is we run randomized control trials in every election. And I'll describe what those are in a second. But the reason this is important is just last year, as an example, 2021, an odd year when most groups weren't doing any voter turnout, we were active in over 380 elections, using every election, big and small, as an opportunity to turn these non-voters into voters, but also as an opportunity to test messaging. Because when you iterate and reiterate and talk to voters every single week of every month of every year, boy, is it a great opportunity to figure out which messages work best with which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists. And so what we do is we run something called randomized control trials. And very, very quickly, what we mean by that is, let's say we identify 1 million super environmentalists in Pennsylvania who are unlikely to vote. What we do not do is immediately start talking to all 1 million of them. Instead, before we talk to a single person, what we do is we randomly separate that 1 million into 2 groups. So about 15% live in what's called a control group, and we never talk to them. The remaining 85%, that's in what's called a treatment or intervention group. These are the people who we canvass and call and mail and send digital ads to, all with this behavioral science informed messaging designed to get them to vote. Then the election happens. Then we have to wait for a few months. But then, whether you vote or not is public record. Voter files are updated and we can see how many people voted in our control group and compare it to how many people voted in our treatment group. And as long as that initial separation was truly random, and as long as those 2 groups are large enough that you get what's called statistical significance, and whether you're a statistician or not, I'm sure you can imagine why it's important to have really big numbers to get an accurate read on this stuff. And as long as we do that, that enables us to isolate what our sole impact was on turnout while controlling for all outside variables. Because even if the Biden campaign spent $1 billion in Pennsylvania, well, we've controlled for that. We've controlled for that. Unless they hacked into our system and decided to only talk to people in the Environmental Voter Project's treatment universe, we've controlled for that. If it was raining in Pittsburgh and that depressed turnout, well, there are just as many Pittsburgh residents in our control group as in our treatment group. We've controlled for that. And what this approach does is allows us, as I said, to isolate what our sole impact is on turnout while controlling for these outside variables. And as you can see, just last year, we were able to increase turnout as much as 4 percentage points over our control group in local elections, and as much as 1.2 percentage points over our control groups in statewide general elections. If those numbers don't seem big to you, ask Donald Trump how big a deal 1.2% is in Pennsylvania. These are big numbers in this business. See that 0.9 in Georgia? That was in those 2 US Senate runoffs that decided control of the United States Senate. $1 billion with a B dollars were spent in those 2 US Senate runoffs. We spent $550,000 in Georgia and still could cut through $1 billion worth of static and measure statistically significant results showing that we were solely responsible for boosting turnout almost 1 percentage point among the over 300,000 low propensity environmental voters we were targeting. Over the long term, over just the past 6 years, we're a 6-year-old organization, we have now spoken to 8.7 million unique low propensity environmental voters. The end of last calendar year, we could see on voter files that over 1,030,000 of them had become such consistent voters that they were voting regularly in federal elections, state elections, and even local elections. This long-term metric, creating these super voters, that is our true goal. That is our true goal. Now, I want to be clear, this doesn't have the same scientific rigor as a randomized control trial. I can't claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1 million non-voters into super voters, but we're pretty darn responsible. I can tell you there is no other group working in over 380 teeny little local elections in 2021. We're the ones putting in the time working year round to make this happen. And finally, I'll just say, and I'd love to get into more detail in the Q&A if this is something that's of interest to you. What all these randomized control trials tell us works best, the reason we are able to boost turnout with numbers like this while controlling for all outside variables, is because we don't talk about climate and the environment. What we have discovered and what a generation of behavioral psychologists and behavioral economists and political scientists have discovered is that the best way to change people's behavior is almost never to try to rationally convince them of the importance of doing X or doing Y. Instead, we treat people as social animals. We use peer pressure. We'll send someone a text message and we'll say, hey, Wendy, did you know last time there was an election, 127 people on your block of Main Street turned out to vote? It's juvenile, but it works. It sends turnout through the roof. Or we'll use certain techniques like loss aversion, where if someone votes in presidential elections, but not in midterms, we'll thank them for having voted in the 2020 presidential election. And then instead of making voting in a midterm seem like a new big thing that they have to do, we'll say, don't ruin your good voting history by skipping the upcoming election. We'll make it seem like they're about to lose something of value that they already have. These are the types of little behavioral nudges that we use that are much, much, much more powerful than having discussions with people trying to get them to vote because it's important because they care about climate. All right, I'm going to speed to the end so we can get to the Q&A. We've gotten a lot of coverage for this work. We're very grateful that this precise data science and behavioral science approach is getting a lot of attention, getting a lot of great results. And just looking ahead to the upcoming now 7 weeks and 6 days until election night, we are active in 17 states. These are the 17 states where the Environmental Voter Project is working in. And to give you an idea of how large our target population is in these states, we have individually identified 5.8 million already registered super environmentalists in these states who have never, ever, ever voted in a midterm or lower turnout election. To give you a breakdown of what the numbers are like in each state, and don't worry, I'm not going to read through all of them, but I will just focus on one. You'll see in Arizona, we've identified almost 250,000 of these already registered super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote in midterms. And that's after removing our control group. How big is that number in a state like Arizona? Well, it's so big that, as you'll see in the second column here, well, fewer than 2.4 million people cast ballots last time Arizona had a midterm election. And so our target population this fall is so big, it would equal 10.5% of all ballots that were cast last time the state had a midterm. This is what I mean by this turnout problem also being an extraordinary opportunity. And just to carve out a few of those 17 states that I just mentioned to you, as you can see, in a lot of very important, impactful states 55 days from now, these non-voting environmentalists could be enormous difference makers. So I'm going to end there. Please feel free to go to environmentalvoter.org to learn more about your work. But what I'm really excited to do is answer your questions and have a discussion with you about some of this data science, some of this behavioral science, and any other questions you might have about what I just mentioned.
Great. Thank you so much, Nathaniel, for all that information. That was quite an exciting presentation. I wanted to just start off with an initial question that jumped to mind when I see your map of the influential states that you're focusing on, those green states. I do not see California among those states, although it seems to me like it would be an influential state just from the demographic size alone. So I know you probably have limited resources that you have to allocate to where you have the most impact, but what exactly is the reason that you're not focusing on California?
Really, really great question. So I'm just going to show the map again so people are aware of what these 17 states are. So we use 3 criteria to determine which states that we work in. One, where are there disproportionately large populations of non-voting environmentalists, right? Like, it doesn't matter how good we are if like there are only 20 non-voting environmentalists in a state and we turn them all into super voters. Like, who cares? That's not going to change policymaking. Second criteria we use is we like to get lots of bites at the apple. No matter how smart we are, no matter how much we optimize our messaging, if we can only talk to people, once or twice every 2 years, because that's all the elections that they have, that really limits our ability to increase turnout. And then finally, third, we don't just care about federal policymaking, we care about state and local policymaking. So when we look at those 3 criteria, that's why we are in these 17 states. Why is California not among them? Well, California fits a few of those criteria. First, yes, there are huge numbers of non-voting environmentalists in the state. So we've got that. 2, is it important on the state and local level and not just the federal level? Yeah, it is. But the criteria that it doesn't fit is that usually, not always, but usually, California doesn't have odd year elections, or it has very few of them. That's a problem. If you're gonna, try to start eating healthier or go to the gym and exercise more often, you're not going to do it once every 2 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. You're going to try to go as often as possible because that's how you change behavior. Well, if in a state we can only talk to voters maybe 2, 3, 4 times every 2 years, that's not enough bites at the apple to really change behavior over time. So that's why, as of yet, we haven't gone into California, because it's missing that really, really key behavior change ingredient.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Doug. Speaking about local effects, he wants to know, can you talk if your organization is working at all on public utility commission elections? You mentioned, small elections. Do you work on that front? And also, do you have other insight into, he says, candidate development for local races?
Yeah, so we absolutely work in public utility commission races. So first, let me say, we try to never let any election pass us by. Because if you remember from that sort of long-term impact chart that I showed, regardless of whether we have an impact in the upcoming, say, Senate election in Arizona, I can tell you, we're walking into this fall having helped turn 60,000 non-voters into super voting environmentalists in Arizona because of the work we have done over the last 4 years in that state. And that work has involved treating every election as a precious behavioral intervention opportunity. So we don't even let library trustee elections go by. But Doug, there is no doubt that PUC and other local energy regulatory bodies and even state energy regulatory bodies pack an enormous wallop. That's a huge ROI if you're a volunteer or a donor in trying to change climate and energy policy. And so, boy, do we pay a lot of attention to those races. We love those races, especially in places where they're not statewide, where they're specific districts. And I would even, Doug, go a step further. There are a lot of municipalities in the Northeast, they're called municipal light districts, but even in places like Colorado, you have a lot of municipally owned, coal-fired power plants, where you change 1 or 2 city councilors and you could shut down a coal-fired power plant. That is an enormous point of leverage. And yeah, we love elections like that. The second part of your question, Doug, candidate development, no, that is not something that we do. We are a nonpartisan organization. We do not support particular candidates. But that doesn't mean that the underlying premise of your question isn't valid. Boy, is it important to develop those candidates, especially climate leaders in local races. And I can tell you there's an organization, Climate Cabinet, that does extraordinary work in that area, recruiting and developing climate leaders at the local level. And I encourage you to check them out.
Great, thank you. So Nancy had a question that was very similar to what you just were talking about. So it sounds like you both treat every election as important, but also get really fired up when there's a particularly competitive race where you might be able to stop that coal-fired plant, or maybe stop somebody from getting elected who's a complete climate denier. Is that a correct characterization?
Yeah, that's pretty fair. I mean, we certainly need to be careful as a nonpartisan organization to, it isn't like we keep our powder completely dry and then dump it all into one race or something like that. But, we, like any nonprofit, don't have unlimited resources, and we're not going to throw the kitchen sink at a library trustee race and drop $1 million on it either. Like, yes, we absolutely marshal our resources and put them towards the races where we think our efforts can have the biggest impact on climate and environmental policymaking. But we also recognize that some of the biggest ways that we can have an impact is to kind of zig where other groups zag, and using these elections that most people don't pay attention to as our way to find really efficient, high ROI points of leverage to turn these non-voters into voters is super important. So I'll give just an example of this. We're probably going to end up spending $150,000 in New Hampshire for the November 8th midterms there. They've got some close state legislative races, they've got 2 close congressional races, and they have a close US Senate race. But we also didn't ignore the primary that just happened yesterday. We probably spent about $15,000 or $20,000 on that, because every non-voter who we could get to vote in this much lower turnout, lower salience primary that happened yesterday, man, I can guarantee you they are going to show up again on November 8th, not just because voting is habit forming, but also because of the public nature of the voter file. You get someone to vote for the first time in a low turnout primary, about a month later, there's a bright red beacon next to their name and everybody says, holy moly, that person just voted in a primary. They're definitely going to vote in the general. Let's go get them. And what's more, let's figure out what issues they care about. And that's how we elect climate leaders, and that's how we get people to legislate and lead on climate.
Great. So you're talking a little bit about the costs that you're putting into these elections. Dan had a question. Can you estimate the approximate cost per, outcome of voter who wasn't going to vote before, based on your efforts?
Absolutely. It's a great question, Dan. We can do better than estimate. We take this very seriously and we precisely measure it. But because we're so precise about it, Dan, I'm going to have to start by giving a whole bunch of caveats. So let me start with the caveats. One, our cost per additional vote depends quite a bit on, one, the type of election, right? So it's a lot cheaper to turn a non-voter into a voter in a lower turnout local race than it is in a really high turnout presidential election. The second thing is it depends on the sort of basket of interventions that you throw at a voter. If there's someone who you don't have their cell phone, you can't canvass them, but you can only send them direct mail, the ROI, the cost per additional vote, is going to be very different from someone who you can do all of your interventions with. All those big caveats, those 2 big variables aside, I can say this. Usually in local elections, our cost per additional vote, and what I mean by that is votes that we know we are solely responsible for creating in randomized control trials. So without our intervention, these people would have stayed home. In these local elections, usually it's anywhere from about $10 to $15 per additional vote. In much higher turnout midterm elections, it can be anywhere from $30 to $55. Again, depending on the types of interventions that you can deliver over different communications mediums. In really, really high turnout elections, presidentials, again, the baseline level of turnout is much, much higher. So it's going to be much, much harder to pull those remaining people off the sidelines, and much more expensive. Usually that's going to be anywhere from $50 to $70 per additional vote. In some states, even higher than that. But we religiously track this stuff, not just so we can report back to our volunteers and to our donors, but also because we don't just want to measure which messages are the most effective. We also want to measure which messages are the most efficient, not just per dollar spent, but per volunteer hour spent. The volunteer is going to give us 2 hours of their time. Boy, do we want it spent in the most efficient way possible. So yeah, we regularly track this stuff. And it's a great question, Dan.
Yeah, these questions are segueing so perfectly. So Nancy has a question about volunteering and these interventions. Do you make use of volunteer letter writers? I know that there's sometimes maybe you would have to stay with a specific script as opposed to just, penning your own letter. But is that something that you do?
Yeah, so really great question. Up until about a year and a half ago, we did not do any volunteer postcards or letter writing. Because although we were aware of it being extraordinarily popular with volunteers, we had looked at every single randomized controlled trial we had seen, and not a single one of them showed that those interventions increased turnout with statistical significance. And we had all these other things that volunteers could do. And we said, well, if we can't prove that this is having an impact, we're not going to ask volunteers to do it. Then a year and a half ago, so coming out of the 2021 election cycle, we saw 2 randomized control trials that showed if you use specific designs on postcards and specific language, there were postcards, volunteer written postcards, that did statistically significantly increase turnout in randomized control trials. So we've started doing that. So yes, we do have volunteers write postcards for us, but as you can imagine, we're really rigorous about it. It's not like write whatever you want, choose whatever design you want, send it whenever you want. No, it's the opposite of that. It's here's the design, we're going to send the postcards to you, here's the script, and make sure to put them in the mail on this precise day because we know that's what works. As far as letter writing, we have yet to see a randomized control trial that shows that it increases turnout in a statistically significant way. And so we don't do that. But I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting that they don't work. I am just suggesting that we don't have proof that they don't work. And chances are we don't have proof that they don't work simply because it takes a really long time to write a letter. And so it's really hard to just get large enough numbers to have a valid experiment to show that they work. So I don't want to imply that volunteer written letters don't work. We just don't have proof of it yet. And so the letters is not something we ask our volunteers to do.
That makes sense. So we had first a quick follow-up comment from Dan saying, wow, those costs are really low. TV ads can be 10 times as much or more. So yeah, that's great that you're getting results for low costs. We had a question from Katie who said that she used to write postcards for EVP. Yay, Katie. And also she used to do texting, but then because of a change in the laws, no texting anymore. So can you comment on what happened there?
Yeah, so Katie, that's right. And thank you for doing postcards. It's not quite that the laws changed. It's that the mobile phone carriers themselves enacted new rules last fall. These rules are called, these rules are called 10DLC rules. It's not important what 10DLC stands for. What these rules mean is the mobile phone carriers now no longer permit you to text people who have not previously opted into receiving those texts. And what they've said is they are going to levy fines on people who do that, and they are going to restrict deliverability of those texts. Now, I want to be clear. There are still organizations that are texting voters. And I don't want to pass judgment and say like, oh my gosh, they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing. We have not gotten word of significant fines being passed down yet. But we have heard that huge numbers of the texts that volunteers are sending are being stopped, being blocked and not delivered by these mobile carriers. And our approach at the Environmental Voter Project is we have all these things from randomized control trials that we know work, and all these things that we can ask volunteers to do, door-to-door canvassing, phone banks, writing postcards. We have randomized control trials proving those things work. So we don't want to ask volunteers to spend their precious time and energy doing something that could end up having huge fines land on us, and then all of our donors were going to have to spend their money paying fines. Or second, have volunteers spend an hour sending texts, only for us to realize that 78% of them were blocked and never delivered. Now, again, I want to reiterate, there are great organizations whom I respect who are still sending text to voters. And it's not like this upcoming election is unimportant. If they've decided to send text to voters, far be it from me to argue against that. But the reason we're not doing it is we feel like there is much more valuable ways to spend your donations and your volunteer time.
Thank you, Nathaniel. So we're at time, but I just thought I would ask you as a closing question to step back from the weeds here and just thinking about the bigger picture. Can you comment on your organization's mission and how it is kind of addressing these two crises that are happening in society right now, like a democracy crisis and a climate crisis, and how you are kind of forging your path?
Yeah, I have not spent any time talking about these enormous crises this evening, and I think we're all very painfully aware of the enormity of the moment that we are living through right now. And I hate even using language that would make people feel more anxious than they actually are, but I think it is objectively true that we're getting to the point where each big election could be the last free election that we have in the United States. We're at a very, very fragile moment. And we're at a similarly fragile moment in the climate crisis. And I'm not just proud of the work that we're doing with our thousands of volunteers and the results that we're getting because of our ability to impact elections and long-term results in the electorate, because I care about politics and care about policymaking, but also because it is unavoidable that politics is always going to be part of the climate crisis. It just is. And I have to say to everybody, ideology is becoming less and less important. There are very few honest brokers in politics who are sitting around a table and, gosh darn it, they all want to solve the climate crisis, but they just can't agree on something. Like, no, we all know that's not what's happening. What's happening is that people are trying to get political power and then spend it. And so what we in the climate movement have to recognize is that we need power. And I know that's like an awful thing to talk about. I mean, I even feel icky talking about it. I mean, we're a nonpartisan organization, but surprise, surprise, I personally am a very progressive person. And progressives don't like talking about power. It's like icky. But the truth is, we in the climate movement can't scare the bejesus out of politicians yet. And we need to. We need to get to the point where nobody can run for office at the local, state, or federal level without saying, oh my God, where did all these environmental voters come from? If I don't do what they demand, I won't win. If we can get to that point, oh my gosh, will so many policy outcomes open up to us? Because what I will say to everybody is that even in this extraordinarily partisan moment, there is still one thing that unites all Democrats and Republicans. And that is, boy, do they both like to win elections. I mean, there is nothing that motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. And so I would encourage all of you, whether you consider yourself to be partisan or not, whether you're left, right, or center, you are here because you care deeply about addressing the climate crisis. And you need to, I beg of you, you need to get involved in politics. And what's more, you need to use your social power to model to others in your community that being a voter is part of what makes you a climate activist. It's part of what makes you a good environmentalist, because take it from a behavioral scientist. Everybody is always looking at you for cues to see what it means to be a good environmentalist. And so make sure you're sending out those vibes. You are a voter because you are also a climate activist. If you can do that, you're going to change the behavior of a lot of people around you.
Wow, that is a wonderful close. I am motivated, and November 8th, here we come. Thank you so much for joining us for this lecture, and we're just so pleased to have you. So thank you again.
Well,
Thanks
thank
everyone
you,
for
Wendy.
joining us. Goodbye.